Hello, everyone, and welcome to The Ignorant Intellectual on Media. I'm your host, Scott, and today I thought we would do something Canadian. All right. And with books. So, Canadian books. So, I think it would be fun. Anyway, so basically, if you read Canadian literature, and many people do, you will have a very difficult time not coming across the New Canadian Library. All right. So, the New Canadian Library is an imprint of McClellan and Stewart, and it's dead now. Um, but for 70 years, it was probably the greatest imprint for Canadian literature that has ever existed in Canada. So it's called the New Canadian Library, even though it's not new. It was when it first came out, but they just kept that name. Um, and it started back in 1958 when Malcolm Ross, who was a professor, I think he was at the University of Toronto, but he could have been elsewhere because he's been all over the map. Um, what was teaching a course, in Canadian literature, and he had such a difficult time finding books for his students to study because there were none. Most of the great Canadian literature books were out of print, and if you were going to find them, you'd have to find them in their original publishing dates. So um, a lot of them were out of print. A lot of them you could only find in hardcover, in used bookstores, if you could find them at all, right? So there was no really central library or anything that you could read Canadian literature at the time. This is back in the mid 50s or whatever, right? So he approached, if I remember correctly, he approached Jack McClellan, um, of McClellan and Stewart, and said, uh, I need these books for my students. We should start an imprint, call it the New Canadian Library, and we should start publishing all the great Canadian books in paperback for a reasonable price. Okay, so this type of idea was already, you know, uh, implemented by different companies, historically, like you know, like the Modern Library or the Everyman Library, which published books for a cheap amount so that anybody could buy them. But what Ross wanted was, he looked at the market in Canada for Canadian literature and was sorely lacking. All right, and he said there's so many great books in Canada that Canadians can't read, and especially his students um, can't study because you just can't find half of them, right? So they started the New Canadian Library in 1958, and they started publishing um, Canadian books of literature. So novels, short stories, some criticism, literary criticism, and some poetry. But their main focus was the Canadian novel, with minors and short stories, poetry, and literary criticism. Right. So most of the library are Canadian novels. So they started printing it, and the first one they printed was, okay, and they decided that they were going to number them. All right, so um, the numbering system was on the spine and on the front and on the back. Now it's gone. Now let's do a little history. So it's gone through six versions. I call them six series. All right, although they may not be series. They're more like they got bored of one cover, and so they changed it up for another cover, right? And they did that six times, okay, in their history, from 1958 until like 2020. And since 2020, you haven't had a New Canadian Library book published, and I'll go into the reasons why that is. But right now, let's start with the basic history of the library. So it started in 1958, um, and it's gone through six series, or six different covers in its series, and it's went from a numbered series to a non-number series. All right, and it's went from more of a concentration on Canadian literature to more of a popularity contest in the after Ross left. Right, so Ross is based. Ross was an academic, right? So he wanted to publish, you know, so that if you read that library, you would have a really good overall view of Canadian literature and its history. Whereas, as the imprint went along and Ross left and others took over, it went from no to selling rather than historical perspective. So a lot of titles were dropped because they weren't good sellers. A lot of titles that were good sellers were more promoted, and the library shrank. But that's in the future. At the beginning in 1958, they started publishing, and they got up to 68 titles before they changed the cover to to a to a second cover, and then they went from that up to we got to investigate that. I'll I'll put it here. The second series. Um, if I remember, went up to 140 something, but I'll put the exact number below. All right. Um, and then it changed its cover again, and it went to a third series, and that third series continued the numbering up to 196. So the full library, the numbered library, goes from number 1 to 196. Now it's the total number of volumes is up for grabs. I collected this library for decades, and um, once they stop numbering the books, um, you don't know how many are in the library, but for sure, from 1 to 196 exist. After that, any any uh, any book that was published after that wasn't given a number, so you don't know how many are still in the library after number 196. But there isn't a super large amount of them. Um, with my research and my collecting of this library, I have a number, but I can't remember that number, but I'll put it down here again. All right. So basically 1958 to about 2020, this imprint existed in some sort and was publishing great Canadian books. All right. So let's go through the six different series that it's gone through and how to recognize those books. And maybe you'll get into collecting the new Canadian library because it was the most popular imprint for Canadian books. Uh, you know, since the beginning of concentrated Canadian publishing um, began in the 50s, right? So if you're going to read a Canadian literature book, you're probably going to find a new Canadian library edition of it that you're going to read, right? Um, so it's fun. It's probably the funnest and only really library to collect on Canadian literature in Canada. Um, it's our modern library or our everyman library, but instead of being small hardcover books, they're in paperback. Now so I'll show you an example of the first series. Okay, so here it is. Here's number 54, The Double Hook by Sheila Watson, which if you have not read, you should read. This is an amazing novel. Okay, um, and it's not thick. It's like less than 200 pages. It's like 133 pages. All right. So basically, up until the 80s, you had the book, and at the beginning you would have an introduction by a literary Canadian literary person, either an author or a literary critic, that introduces you to the novel, right? So this one was done by John Groove. All right. So at the beginning of each one, you would have an introduction to the novel and its place in Canadian literary history. Although the accuracy of some of the things that are written in them is up for question. But anyway, so as literary criticism developed, because remember this was the first basic imprint dedicated to Canadian literature in paperback in the history of Canada. Okay, so they were starting anew, right? And some of the criticism, some of the accuracy of these introductions uh, are a bit lacking, but you find that out later on as literary criticism develops in Canada, right? So, but anyway, so this is an example. Here's another example. Here's Further Foolishness by Stephen Leacock, and this is number 60. Okay, so here's two examples of the first series of books by the New Canadian Library. Now, every one of them will have the author the author printed down the side of it. Okay, and then the name of the novel at the top, and then an artist's rendering of the author. Okay, so this is what Stephen Leacock looks like, and this is what um, Sheila Watson looks like. All right, and this would go on for 68 titles. All right, so from 1 to 68, we're in this um, cover. Okay, this edition, this series. Okay, so this is what they look like in the back. All right. So each would have an introduction by a prominent Canadian writer or critic, and then you would get the novel. And these were mostly put out so that students would have access to these novels for Canadian literary courses in universities and colleges across Canada. Right, that was their main purpose. All right, um, and they were made very well. And, the only thing that happens to these books over time is that they brown. Right, but the paper stock is very good on these. Unlike in later editions, they became more cheaper, right? And the actual artwork is very nice, and the covers are thick, and the paper stock is thick. So they hold pretty well, and the glue holding them holds pretty well. So you can still find these even 70 years later in conditions like this. This is a very good condition book, right? Because they're very well made. So this is the first one. It goes from 1 to 68. So then they decided to change. I'm not sure what the date of the change um, of the new ones were. Okay, it looks like it happened pretty quickly, like in the 1970s, I think. And so in the 1970s, they changed it to a second. All right, and this is what the second series looks like. Okay, so it's got a border around it that's a different color than the centerpiece. All right, and you still have the numbering on the spine at the bottom. All right. So this one here is Settlers of the Marsh, and this number is number 50. All right, in the library, and this one is number 107, and it's Headwaters of Canadian Literature. It's a literary criticism novel book by Archibald MacMeekin. MacMeekin. All right. So and it's number 107. All right. So after they printed number 68, they continued with the new covers. Now, what would happen is you may ask, well, why is this number 50 if they printed it in this edition up until 1968? Well, you know anything about publishing? What happens is so were the ugliest of just the these were the ugliest ones, and they were also they're the most plentiful. When you look for New Canadian Library books, this is the one that you'll find most often because it's the imprint or the cover style that takes up the most volume. So it went from uh, 69 to 140 something, if I remember. It was like 80 something. I'll put it down here, volumes or whatever. So the first set was 68 volumes. The second set was much larger, and then the third set, when they moved to the third um, cover was smaller. It was only like 25, and then they just got rid of the numbering. But so the first numbering you'll get on the front, all right, and you'll get it on the back, all right, and you'll get it on the spine, and number 60. Okay, so um, this one you won't. You'll get it on the front at the top, all right. You'll get it on the back at the top, and you'll get it on the spine, all right. So I'm not sure why they put N there all the time. It doesn't mean anything. I mean, N novel, I guess, might be the reason for it because there's three different series of books in it. You got the N series, which is the novels, I guess, and the literary criticism. And then you got the um, O series, which is the poetry section of it. And then you have the W series, which is the writers section of it. All right. So, but the main one that goes up to 196 is the novel section. So they all have ends on it for novel, I'm assuming, right? See, the original ones didn't have the N on it, right? So anyway, so um, this is number 50, and it has a border, and they're freaking ugly. Basically, these are the ugliest versions. So series 2 is the ugliest, but it's also the most popular version of it. It's the ones that you're going to find the most. All right. So okay, so now let's go to the third series. Okay, and the third series looked like this. All right, so they were white covers, and they had a border of New Canadian Library, or sorry, a ribbon style New Canadian Library across the front, and they were done in black and white. And the only thing that was in color was the name of the novel or the short story, the title of the book, in other words. All right. Some of them, if they, uh, some older ones or newer ones would have the person on the back, but others wouldn't. All right. So they were kind of moving around. So and depending on the beginning of the edition to later editions, they're kind of a little bit different as you go along. Also, what they did was they highlighted, um, the iconic novels in their library uh, in series 3 by, instead of putting a black and white teletype type of ribbon across, they were in gold across. Now I don't have an example of it right now, but you'll notice that some of them will have a gold imprint across. That's just to highlight the iconic novels in the library, right? So here's two. This one is number 53, all right, and it's My Remarkable Uncle by Stephen Leacock, and this one is number 169, all right. So we're getting up into the higher numbers, and it's The Angel of the Tar Sand and Other Stories, all right. So this is the series that goes up to 196, all right. So it goes from like 148 or something to 196, but again, you were saying, but how is this one number 50? There's so many books here. Just uh, How is this one number 50 when it's in the second series? Okay, so how publishing works is uh, they'll do batches at a time, right? So I'm not sure exactly how many they did for each batch at the New Canadian Library at McClellan and Stewart, but they'll do a batch. Let's say, as an example, let's say they do batches of 10 or 6 or something like that. So let's just take 10, okay? So the first printing of the, let's say, series 1 was from 1 to 10, and then maybe from 11 to 20, and then they go through that over the years, right? All right. So then they get up to 68, and maybe they see sales declining and say, okay, we need to freshen this up. So then they change the covers, all right, and then they start printing from 69 in the new cover. So 69, let's say, to 75, they print in the new cover. But it doesn't mean that from 1 to 68, people don't want those books, right? So what happens is, after they printed them and they sell out, if they were still in the first, if the years that they were still putting out the first covers, they're still in that time period, then they're going to continue putting them out with the same covers. But once they switch to series 2, and let's say number 50 runs out in the series 1 cover, well, they're going to print it number 50 in the series 2 cover. So what you'll get is, that from 1 to 68 um, are in the first cover, but from then on, you only know that 69 to 140, or whatever the number is that I put down there, um, are in series 2. But you're also going to find um, the numbering from series 1 into series 2 of those books in series 1 that have sold out, and now they're in series 2, and they're going to print them again, but they're going to print them with series 2 covers. So hopefully I'm not confusing um, what I'm saying. So let's say, for example, from 1958 to 1968, they're using these first covers, okay? So now 1968 comes, and they go, okay, it's time to refresh the library. So at 69, they start making these covers, all right? So now they're still putting out these, but anybody who orders, let's say number 60, okay, let's say this still has like 5,000 or 10,000 copies in the warehouse, and a bookseller orders 50 more of these or whatever, right? So when they order the 50 more, they're going to get this cover, even though this cover is out now, right? And once these ones run out, if they get another order and they have no more of these, then they'll print it in this cover and put it out. All right. So from 1 to 68 are going to be in this cover, and 69 to 140 or whatever it is will be in this cover, but you don't know unless you find it whether number 50 will be in this cover. It just depends on how many of these ones were sold. All right. So if these ones were all sold and people are still demanding this title, then it'll come in this form as well. All right. Because they've run out of the new ones and they're not printing the old ones, and they're not printing these covers anymore. So they print them in this cover. Same thing will happen uh, after, let's say, 148 or whatever the number is. Um, and they move to the third thing, all right, that from 69 up to 1, whatever it is in this one, but now they're switching to this cover. So once these ones run out, or these ones run out, maybe there's still some in the warehouse that are like this because the title wasn't very popular, all right, and it took a long time for them to sell them all. But then they get another demand for this book, and so they'll print it in this one and give it the same number, right? So but for sure, 1 to 68 comes from this, 69 up to whatever, 140 or whatever it is, come in this, and then from 140 whatever or whatever number it is, 168. I think it might have been 160. I'm not sure. Up to 196 come in this. All right. So you'll have, you know, what I'm trying to say is, 1 to 68 will be like this. You don't know 1 to 68 will be like this. It may be a smattering of different numbers between 1 to 68 that'll be in this one or this one, maybe not all of them. All right. I don't think all of them have come in this one between 1 and 68. Not all of them has come in this one or this one. They're only printed them as the orders come in, right? So many of them that were in 1 to 68 that weren't very popular, and therefore they weren't printed in this one or this one. Well, you can only find in this cover. Um, you will not find any numbered from after 68 in this cover because they no longer printed this cover, right? So, and the number 69 up to whatever the numbering system for Series 2 is, um, you may not find in this cover, but you may find individual ones that are more popular in this cover. Okay, so those are the first three covers. Series 1, all right, Series 2, all right, and Series 3. The difference in the number is you had it on the front, the back, well, you had an NC on the back. You had it on the front, all right, right there you have the number. You have the number on the back, okay? In Series 2, you had it on the front on the top, you had it on the back on the top, and you had it on the spine as well. Series 3, what happened was they got rid of the numbering on the spine. All right. And so all you have is the M&S, um, the bookseller M&S, McClellan and Stewart on the spine. You don't have the numbering on it. All right. Where you would find the numbering, because they did continuing the numbers, would be on the inside. All right. So on the inside, you would get it on the title page. So this one is number 53 in the library. So we know that this has a Series 1 title, uh, Series 1 picture, all right, like this one. And it has a Series 2 book because it's number 53 and it's in the third series. It means that this book was popular enough to be printed in Series 1, sold out, and Series 2 sold out, and now they're printing it in Series 3, all right, because it was popular enough to continue to be printing because it's number 53. So you'll get it on the inside cover, all right, number 53, and you'll get it on the back. But even later editions of Series 3, um, there was a transition period into Series 4 where they basically dropped the numbering altogether. And the first thing they did was dropped it on the back, or this on the back first, and then they dropped it on the inside cover. But of these series 3 numbers up to 196 had numbering, all right? And then after 196, they went to series 4, all right? And series 4, where's series 4? Looks like this, okay? Now, this is the first covers or series that got rid of the numbering altogether. So once all the numbering, it got up to 196, and then no more numbering, all right? So some of these books will be in series 1, series 2, and series 3 if they were popular enough, and then they get published in series 4. But then they have no numbering on them. And every book that hasn't been published in series 1, 2, or 3, in other words, there are new additions to the library uh, in series 4, series 5, and series 6, won't have any numbering on it. So it's difficult to know exactly the total amount of books in the New Canadian Library. It's more than 196 because they published new titles after Series 3, Series 4, Series 5, and Series 6 had new titles to them, which would add to the number of books in the New Canadian Library. So there's over 200 of them in total, but we are not 100% sure um, how many exactly there are. Okay, so we do know that there's more than 196, but we don't know how many more. We can guess as we find these books and buy them. We know that, let's say this one, Emily's Quest, is not in Series 3. Okay, Series 4 has this. Series 5 has it, and maybe Series 6 has it. I'm not sure. The popularity of this would dictate whether it would end up in Series 5 and Series 6. But we know that this title I know that this title is not numbered from 1 to 96 to the best of my recollection. So this is a new title. So once we get this book in our library, in my library, I know that there's at least 197 titles in the New Canadian Library now. And as I come across, so here's the incomparable Atuk by Mordecai Richler. I would have to look back on 1 to 96 to see if this is included in those. And if not, then I know that this one would be, let's say, a new edition, and that would make at least 198 volumes in the library, okay? But it goes into series 4, which dropped the numbering, which look like this. They're very beautiful. But as you notice, starting from series 2 is like all the books are very browning because the paper stock is not as good as in series 1. Series 3, the same thing, and the glue on series 3's had a tendency to dry out, and then the cover would fall off the actual book, right? They improved the quality on Series 4. Um, so the covers are very nice. They're very beautiful front to back, all right? But they just have no numbering on them anymore, all right? And the stock for the covers is very good, and the stock for the paper isn't much of an improvement, but the glue holds together well. This one here, the Series 3 ones, are the worst when it comes to the quality of the books. So probably you're going to have the difficulty finding Series 3 out of all the different series. Series 3 will be the most difficult to find in good condition because the covers themselves brown over time. If you look, you see that? All right. The glue is not very good and the paper stock is very thin and it falls apart very easily. All right. So these ones are the most difficult to find in really good shape, and they're the most difficult to find in general because once they fall apart, people just throw them in the garbage and then you don't see from them again. They improved the covers on these ones, and they improved the paper stock on these ones as well. And so these ones last better, and these ones are usually you can find in pretty good condition. All right, so this is Series 4, and then after Series 4, they came out with a Series 5. All right, and Series 5 were really beautiful editions, and they look like this. They had a different so they had a similar. It's similar to this one, all right, but they kind of moved the picture and um, they removed the NCL from the side of it. See the NCL there on the side? They removed that. They moved where the picture and they centered the picture rather than having it on the left side border, right? Or it would be the right, yeah, the right side border. Um, and the backs look very similar as well, right? They kind of changed it, but overall, Series 4 and Series 5 are very similar looking. But Series 5 is is a definite improvement. They're very, very nice editions, right? Um, they look really nice for paperbacks, all right? And they don't have the numbering either, all right? So here's two more. Here's actually Fruits of the Earth, which I think is number one in the series. So this was popular enough to get all the way through all five series, right? And this one is Barometer Rising, which is another one that got through all five series, if I remember correctly. All right. So this is what Series 5 looks like. All right. All right. At the end, I'll just go through all of them and I'll show you good. All right. So then Series 6 came along, and Series 6 looks like this. All right. The uh, the paper stock is good, and the covers, they really improved the covers since Series 4, and the covers look really nice ever since then. All right. So this is what they look like. So this is Who Has Seen the Wind, and this one is The Apprenticeship of Duddy Kravitz. All right. So you're starting to see, the classics of Canadian literature rise to the top in the NCL, and they're only publishing the most popular titles of in Canadian literature as they got from Series 5 to Series 6. Now, what they did also is they decided to go from this size, which was the start of the New Canadian Library in Series 6, to um, to this size. All right. So they went from a paperback to a trade paperback. And these are really nice editions. All right. But of course, you're going to pay the extra, right? So that's what they look like on the back. Each one of them has a nice picture of it went from photography rather than pictures. These are what the spines look like. All right. So anyway, so series, you could see a transition from Series 5 where they went from these covers to these covers. So this could be considered Series 6, but these covers, um, you could they didn't print very many of these. These ones are difficult to find. In fact, they kind of when they went from this to this, they kind of jumped to this very quickly, right? So it's hard to consider this really a series unless you group it in with Series 6, which are these larger paper. Uh, Larger ones, right? At least that's how I did it. All right. So they transitioned between this, and you can find these plentiful, all right, but you can't find these very often. So it looks like they dropped these very quickly and moved into that. So this is kind of Series 6 in a paperback version and a because they basically almost look the same, right? From a paperback version to a trade paper version of the library. So they decided to go big, even though their sales were declining, um, and their popularity was declining. They decided to go um, big out, and go from a paperback to a trade paperback. All right. So then that's Series 6. Okay. So hit my microphone here. And what they also did was you could get this book on the shelves like this, but you could also um, print order books, and they would come like this. All right. So this is a print order book, right? Um, so they have like a generic, less elaborate cover to them, but they're still part of Series 6. They're just print to order, right? So basically, it's the same book. It's just a print to order book. So the print to order ones, when they send it out, let's say you order directly from the company or whatever, maybe you need 50 of these for a class because you're a professor or whatever. Then they'd print them out and send them out to you, but they'd print on demand. So it's not on order; it's on demand. Print on demand. These are what the print on demand ones look like. All right. So that's basically the 6 series of the New Canadian Library, and that's it. What happened was, now in the history of the 1958 it started. It was an imprint of McClellan and Stewart. Then McClellan and Stewart, which were quote unquote the Canadian publishers. That's what they coined themselves as. Um, uh, they went up all the way to 1985, 86 when McClellan and Stewart to Avi Bennett. Avi Bennett, is that how you pronounce his first name? Avi Bennett. Anyway, so Avi Bennett basically bought um, McClellan and Stewart in 1985 and 86, and so he continued to publish these New Canadian Library imprints because they're probably the most profitable out of all the different imprints that McClellan and Stewart had, right? So they kept producing them. But what Avi did was in when was it? I wrote it down. I'm not sure what at the date, but Avi ended up. I didn't write the date down. Avi ended up uh, donating 75% of McClellan and Stewart shares to the University of Toronto and sold 25% of the shares to Random House. Now, Random House of Canada, or Random House, is an American imprint at the time, all right? They're the ones that published they started out as the Modern Library, and Random House was kind of like an offshoot of the Modern Library. But then Random House became more popular than the Modern Library, so they renamed themselves Random House, and then they got larger and larger and became one of the biggest, book publishers in the United States, right? So, so Avi sold M&S to Random House. So 25% of this uh, the Canadian publishers was actually owned by an American company, and the other 75% was owned by the University of Toronto. So the imprint, the New Canadian Library, under M&S, was owned by University of Toronto mostly and by Random House. But then what happened was, um, if I remember correctly, yeah, okay, so Random House ended up merging with Penguin. So in Canada, so Penguin is a British publisher, one of the biggest British publishers, and Random House is an American publisher, and they joined forces and merged. And what happened in Canada was Penguin and Random House became the same company in Canada, and they called themselves Random House, Penguin Random House. All right, um, and that was in 2013, and they bought the 75% of McClellan and Stewart off the University of Toronto, if I remember correctly. So they basically, Random House Penguin, basically owned all of McClellan and Stewart, including the NCL. This is in 2013. And that's when you start seeing the decline of the New Canadian Library because it's became an imprint of a publishing company, which is a subsidiary or an imprint of another larger company. And then Penguin Random House was bought by Bartelsmann, which is a German company, like a German conglomerate of publishing houses. They got like over 300 of them, right? Um, they bought Penguin Random House. So now basically the New Canadian Library, or M&S, is owned by a German company, um, and they're not printing any New Canadian Libraries anymore. And that happened in 2020. So basically, since 2020, and uh, the German company bought Penguin Random House, but you saw it with Penguin Random House. You saw a decline in the New Canadian Library publishing, and now it's just basically dead. Okay, but between 1958 and let's say now, there's millions of copies of these books in used bookstores and out in the world or whatever, right? So there's still a lot of fun to collect, right? And you can get them all reasonably priced. I basically I have the complete library um, from 1 to 96. Well, I did. I sold some of the books off to make room in my bookshelves because I stopped collecting it. Once I got all 196 titles, I said, cool. I succeeded because I didn't know what titles came after that. If I found any title that came after that, I also collected it. And I had a very large library of New Canadian Library books. And then, I began reading them all. And then I got um, into other things, and I went away. But for a good 3 years or whatever, I collected the New Canadian Library, and over the last little while, over time, I've sold off pieces of it in order to make room for other things that I collect, right? So, but basically, I still have 1 to 68, and I'm going to make a video of that, of the original, um, these ones, the original New Canadian Library, the Series One New Canadian Library. And those are the best made ones, or the nicest out of all of them. Was the first one. They really did a good job with the paper stock, with the glue, and with the covers, and the artwork is really nice. So the first series was the best out of all six of the series, and I kept those. I didn't sell any of those ones. So I still have 1 to 68. Now, I did mention that the New Canadian Library had three imprints, or sorry, three versions of it. You had the main the main library, which is all the novels, the essays, some of the essays and short stories. But then you had a poetry section, all right, and a writer's section. So the poetry section was just groups of poems, either by an important Canadian poet or an important time in Canadian poetry, because there wasn't enough to, let's say, make a book. So, for example, here's number one in the O series. So it's numbered O1, but it still had that N on top of it. I don't know why they did that, because it's not a novel. But the numbering, it looks like 01, but it isn't. It's O1. All right. So it's the letter O and number one. And this went from O1 to O12. All right. But it looks like 01. So a lot of people got confused when they were collecting the library, thinking that this was the first book in the New Canadian Library, and then they come across the Grove, the Frederick P. Grove novel, which is first in the library, and it had a number one as well, but it had a 01, not an O1, as in the letter. But people got confused with it. Just know that um, O stands for originals. All right, so these are all the poetry books and some of the criticism as well, um, are in the O series, and it stands for New Canadian Library Originals. In other words, they're not reprints of books. They created these books themselves, right, and published them. So the O series, and it went from 1 to 12. Most of them were poets. So this is the first one. It's called Poets of the Confederation. Then you have Poets of Mid-Century. And then you have the poets of the wartime years and things like that in these type of books. And it started with series two, if I remember correctly. All right. So, but you also had individual poets. So here's two examples. This one is number 12, and this one is number 6. All right. So this one is the poems of Earl Burney, and this one is the poems of Irving Layton, two of the big names in Canadian poetry. All right. And they're pretty thin, but you get a uh, good amount of their poems. But remember, these were made mostly for students in Canadian literature courses, right? So Canadian universities wanted to teach about Canadian literature, but they couldn't teach because they couldn't get any of the books, right? So they would teach. So Canadian students were learning British literary history and American literary history in universities. They weren't learning Canadian literary history because they couldn't get access to these books, and that's what the New Canadian Library solved. All right. So you also had, that's the O series, the original series, which had most of the poetry in it, and then you had a W series, and with the W designation, which is a writer series. And what that was, there were 17 volumes in that, and that was basically a like a biography or a look at a Canadian literary giant, I guess you could say. And they would do a book, and there were 17 of them altogether. I don't have any of them presently. I think they're in a box somewhere, but when I looked on my shelves, I couldn't find them. But I had like maybe 12 out of the 17 of them. Anyways, I'm sorry I can't show you an example. Maybe I'll put a picture here of what one of the covers looked like. Okay. And so there were 17 in that. So you had 196 numbered in the main library. You had 12 of the O's, or the originals, which were most of the poetry. And then you had 17 of the W's, which were the writers, biographies on the writers, and literary criticism on their works or whatever, right? Okay, so that's basically the library that went into six. So let's look at them. I'll give one example of each, and then we'll go from there. Okay, so this is we'll do it slowly so that you get a good idea. So this is series one. All right, so that's the front. Here's the spine. All right, with the numbering on the bottom. This is what the back looks like. Okay, so that's series one. All right. Series two, which were the ugliest out of all of them. All right. So there's the front, there's the spine with the numbering, and here's the back. All right. Now there are little variations with these books as transitions going from each series, and sometimes they would do a say a movie tie-in or whatever, where they would have a special edition of the New Canadian Library. You wouldn't even know it's a New Canadian Library because it has no numbering on it or anything else. But when you look inside of of the book, I don't have an example of one now, but there's a movie tie-in sometimes or whatever, or other things, and you look inside the book, and then you would see that it's a New Canadian Library book. But those ones are few and far between. Almost all of them look series two look like this, right? All right, so that's series two. Series three looks like this. It's white. You won't see the numbering on the spine anymore. That's what the spine looks like. Then you'll see the back, and the numbering is here, right? And it's on the title page of the book as well on the inside. All right, so that's number three. And you will get the variations of the gold print ticker tape that goes across in gold for they started it, but they dropped it pretty quickly because it didn't gain traction. So they stopped it, and but you will find some with gold print across. Okay, so that's series three. This is series four. So the numbering is gone now. There is no numbering on it. That's the spine, and that's the back. Series five looked like this. That's the front. That's the spine, and that's the back. All right, series six in paperbacks looked like this. That's the spine, and here's the back. All right, and then when they left the paperback version and went to the trade paperback version, the larger ones, they look like this. So here's the front. Pretty similar basically than the paperbacks. They just use a photograph instead of a drawing for the image, right? And there's the spine, and here's the back. All right, so those are the six series in the New Canadian Library um, for their main uh, series, right? And this is what the print on demand books look like. Okay, so when you're looking for these books, um, if if you're a collector and you like collecting numbering, you're going to get from 1 to 196. But there are others. Um, the main library, you'll find these paperbacks, for a buck or two, right? Maybe three, maybe up to five, depending on their availability, right? But they're usually pretty reasonably priced. You can find them in thrift stores. You can find them garage sales, things like that. You can find them around, right? And but when it comes and the O series as well, the originals, they're very reasonably priced as well. All right. You can go on ABE Books and you can find these as well. But the Writer series was not printed in very large amounts. All right. And the Writer series is very, very difficult to find. Like I said, I found in the you know, I collected them for like 20 years or whatever, but I've seriously collected the New Canadian Library for between 2 and 3 years. And in that 2 and 3 years, I looked everywhere, and I didn't spend exorbitantly, but I still didn't complete the W series of the 17. I think I only got 12 of the 17 of them, right? Because the pricing on some of these thin little pieces of paperbacks or whatever, right? They're only like really thin, right? Um, was an outrageous price because people knew that these are difficult to find, so therefore they want to rip you off or whatever. See, I look at people like if you find something that's rare, okay, um, it's worth nothing unless somebody wants it, right? And the more people want it, um, and the rarer it is. In other words, if there's more people that want it, then there's actually copies of people to get it. Then the price is just going to go skyrocketing, right? Which you know, it, it's the way of the world, right? It's the way of you know capitalist society or whatever, right? So, um, but when you get something that is rare, but nobody wants to collect it, and yet you still try to charge a large amount of money for it, it's just going to sit on your shelf, all right? And but there are people that have them think that because they collect them, that everybody would collect them, and therefore it's popular enough to put a like a ridiculous price on it. Um, then you're if the market will go up or down. But anyways, it's I have a very low threshold on people. I look at that type of thing as gouging people, right? So I mean, if you have a first edition of Old Man and the Sea by Ernest Hemingway, and the first printing of it was only, let's say, 500 copies, of course, that if you want to buy it, you're gonna need to be a rich man to get it, right? But if you have a first edition, first printing of, let's say, John Smith's adventure in fishing. All right. Have you ever heard of John Smith's adventure in fishing? Neither have I, because it doesn't exist. But let's say it does exist, some obscure text of some sort. And then you find it and you go, hey, I look, nobody has this. I'm the only one that has this. This is very rare. And then you try to charge Old Man in the Sea price for it. Um, good luck with that, right? So a lot of the books in the W series um, in the New Canadian Library, you'll see on ABE Books, and they'll be there for years, decades, right? Because the person wants way too much money for it, right? So anyway, um, I got 12 of them at a reasonable price. Each one of them at a reasonable price, but there was five of them that were um, just outrageously priced that I just couldn't um, justify spending that type of money on it. So, but if you're collecting, most people will just collect the main library of 196 titles and see if they can complete that, and then read the books along the way, right? So I haven't read every one of the New Canadian Library books, all 196. I may have read maybe a third of them, right? I haven't read all of them. But as I was collecting, I would pick up one of them and I would read it. And I had a website. It was called nclcollecting.ca. It's no longer online, but it's basically the go-to site. At least it was in the 5 years that I had it up, for anybody that was collecting this library. And there wasn't a lot of people that were collecting this library, but the ones that did, they had that as a resource. Now, I've let that website drop because I couldn't justify spending money on something that I wasn't, collecting anymore, and paying that money every month to a server. Um, so, but you can still access it by going on the Wikipedia page um, for the New Canadian Library, where they'll give you a list of all 196 titles, which they got off my website. Okay, and at the bottom in the credits or whatever at the bottom, you'll see uh, New Canadian Library.ca archive, and if you press that link, the whole website is there in an archive version. All right. So I'm not sure how that happened, but you won't get all the images. So all the images are don't load up on that archive website. So I'm looking into maybe I'll put the uh, put the website up again because it was really I worked on that website for like 4 years, and it has a wealth of information on the new Canadian Library on it. I just couldn't justify spending the hundreds of dollars each year to host that website when I wasn't collecting the library anymore, right? So it's still in archive form. You can find it through the New Canadian Library entry of Wikipedia. At the bottom in the credit area, you'll see New Canadian Library. If you click on that link, it will open up that website, and then you can wander around that website. But it's all going to be text. You're not going to see any images. All right? So, but those okay. So those are the six versions or six series of the New Canadian Library. Um, I will, in another video, do a New Canadian Library, the original 168, and show you the covers of all 168 of the books and the titles of each. The 196 I won't be able to do because I don't have all 196 anymore. I've sold a lot of them. So, but I thought I would introduce you to the New Canadian Library because it's a fun library to collect, and it's not hard enough that you'll never be able to collect the whole thing like some other. Let's say if you're pursuing the Everyman Library, good luck. You're not going to. There's 1,000 titles in that library, and some of them are extremely difficult to find. Like for example, they had a thesaurus in that library, and they had a dictionary, and they had a small, like, if I remember correctly, like a small group of like a dictionary of 4 volumes or whatever, things like that, that are just impossible to find. So it's going to be very difficult for you to complete, let's say, the Everyman Library. Although I collected, I've got like between 100 and 200 volumes of it, but I've got up to around 200 volumes, maybe. It's a guess. I would have to count it of the Everyman Library, and the Modern Library is another one. That one has over 800 titles to it, so you can collect those, and I do. I have like yeah, maybe 100, 150 of the new of the Everyman Library, and I'm going to do it like this video. I'm going to do a video on that and the Modern Library, which is another imprint of about 800 something titles. I have maybe 200 of those, right? And I've been collecting those since the 90s, so I know I'm not going to complete it. But with the New Canadian Library, I completed it. I completed all 196 titles of that New Canadian Library. So it is possible, and it's reasonably priced. Whereas in some of the Everyman Library or the Modern Library books, I'm finding most of them for $5, between $5 and $10 each. You're going to find these ones. You can find these ones for like $1 or two, right? So so the actual budget for it, the the number of titles is smaller, and the budget for each the pricing for each of the books is a lot lower than in the Everyman or Modern Library, right? So, but I would suggest you collect those too. They're fun to collect as well, but you probably won't be able to complete it. You could, depending on your pocketbook, but um, if you uh, are me, like on a budget, the New Canadian Library is very fun to collect. Now, if you're into Canadian literature itself, like books, poetry, and all that, the New Canadian Library has a very large selection of that, but not all the great novels are in the New Canadian Library. There was a main competitor for them. Well, there was two other book publishers. There was Stoddard, and then there was Macmillan. That also, once the New Canadian Library kicked in and started selling books, and they saw that there was a market for Canadian literature, they started publishing books as well in different imprints. And I'll show you a few examples. All right. So here's a Macmillan. All right. This is their paperback version of the New Canadian Library. All right. And you had a whole bunch of different editions of these ones, right? All right. So it was Macmillan and Stoddard. Stoddard is a company, but Macmillan is another. Macmillan is like a subsidiary of Macmillan in England or whatever. I'm not sure who owns it now, but at the time of these things, back in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, Macmillan was probably the best uh, competitor to McClellan and Stewart and the New Canadian Library. They put out a series of paperbacks like this. They look like this, right? They look like this. And them and Stoddard actually, um, Macmillan used Stoddard a lot to publish or to issue some of the books in this style of paperback. All right. because you'll notice some of them will have Macmillan on the top and others will have Stoddard on the bottom. So they combined resources and started publishing Canadian novels to compete directly with the modern library. The New Canadian Library. So you can find these paperbacks as well, that are of good Canadian novels. Right, here's another one, Grey Owl. All right, they look like that. Now these ones weren't numbered. All right, they were just paperbacks. And then you had Macmillan also put out something called the New Press. I think it was Macmillan. Let me double check. No, it was General Publishing, which is also part of Stoddard's group of publishers. General and Macmillan, they combined with these ones as well, I think, if I remember correctly. But anyways, they're the New Press uh, Canadian classics, and they weren't numbered either, but they all look like this. They all had that competitive drive to compete with the New Canadian Library, right? So they're called the New Press Canadian Classics, right? Right. And another imprint, which was owned by Macmillan, if I remember correctly, yeah, Macmillan of Canada, was their Laurentian Library, and this was the direct competitor to the New Canadian Library because these ones were numbered. This is number one, which is Two Solitudes by uh, by Hugh MacLennan, which is one of the big novels in Canadian literature, and you'll notice that um, it ended up going into the New Canadian Library imprint after there was a gentleman, an editor uh, at Macmillan. Man, my brain doesn't work sometimes. Ignorant intellectual, right? Um, at Macmillan that left and went to work for M&S on uh, went and became an editor at McClellan and Stewart, and he brought a lot of the authors that were with Macmillan with him when he went to McClellan and Stewart. So you'll see a lot of the authors that were originally in Macmillan's stable of authors move over to the New Canadian Library later on in series four, I think it was, maybe series four. Anyway, so this is their direct competitor, which is called the Laurentian Library. This is number one, and here's number six. All right, which is Hedy Dorval, which you'll also see in the New Canadian Library later on as well. All right, and that's number six. I'm not sure how many titles are in this edition. Here's number eight, which is called The Sacrifice, which you'll also see in the New Canadian Library later on. All right, by Adele Wiseman. All right, so these, I'm not sure how many they got up to with these ones. I know it wasn't a very large library because they stopped printing them pretty quickly, if I remember correctly. So those are the main ones. And actually, the Laurentian Library ended up going into a trade paperback version of it as well. Here's number 14, all right, which is Who Has Seen the Wind by W.O. Mitchell, which is another big name in Canadian literature. And here's Marie Chapdelaine by Louis Aymon, which is a very large book in francophone culture in Canada, and they translated it into English. All right, and this is number what? This is number 17. It's on the spine, right? So these are kind of fun to collect. They come in two versions. They come in a paperback version and a trade paper. They ended up leaving this and going into the bigger ones. So they're fun to collect as well. So there's at least 17 of them. I'm not exactly sure how many because if I came across them, I'd pick them up, but they're not as plentiful as the New Canadian Library, so they're a little bit more difficult to find, right? So you have like the Laurentian Library, you have like the New Press Canadian Classics, and then you have Macmillan or Stoddard versions of these ones with the triple strip across, you know, which were all the direct competitors to the New Canadian Library. All right, and so that is basically um, an introduction to the New Canadian Library, the biggest source for Canadian literature in Canada, in the history of Canada, in the history of Canadian publishing. All right. So if you're reading Canadian literature, do not be surprised if the book that you're looking at is part of the New Canadian Library. All right. So it just dominated the field when it came to Canadian literature in Canada from 1958 until its death, being owned by Bartlesman in 2020. But Penguin Random House See, it's all about the market. Is there a market for Canadian literature in Canada? So many Canadians will read foreign literature and not read Canadian literature because they don't think it's up to snuff compared to, international literature. So a person will read a an American novel. They'll read like Moby Dick before they'll read Barometer Rising, right? So um, I don't know why that is. It's because Canada has an inferiority complex when it comes to direct competition with Britain or with the United States, right? So it seems to be that way, and we seem to enjoy Canada. If I was to what tell you what Canadian culture is basically world culture. Out of all the cities and all the places in the world, now my experience is limited, all right, but whatever country you go to, they're proud to be that, and they promote their own culture. Um, and American culture will be beside it because it's such a large cultural influence in the world. But if you're English, you know your English history. You read English novels, you'll watch English television, you'll watch English films, so on and so forth. And people know English culture. All right, Canadians know English culture because it's a big influence in Canada as well as in Britain, right? We know American culture because we're next door to like that big elephant, and it just floods in across the border, all their culture as well. And we have a smaller Canadian culture, but Canadian culture, if you want it to be, let's say, Canadian, um, uh, you have to kind of search for it. All right, you have to actually put your laser beams on it and go look for it rather than it just coming to you like American or British culture does, right? So, but it's there, all right. But Canada is the most international country in the world, I think, because we have people from everywhere in Canada, all right. Um, so Canadian culture is basically just a hodgepodge of a lot of it, anyways. Is basically a hodgepodge of all cultures from around the world that have come to Canada, and now it's part of Canadian culture, this mosaic or whatever, right? So Canada's the most international country in the world. Like if the world decided that they didn't want countries anymore, and they would probably look at Canada as a great example of that type of ideology, I guess you could say. Maybe I'm just boasting, I don't know. But if living in Canada, there is Canadian culture, but you have to go search for it, right? It's not blatantly in your face like American culture is. And with Canada's history with England and Great Britain, that culture is in Canada as well, right? And all the French culture as well, right? So you have this culture from outside of territorial Canada, let's say, and you have all the indigenous culture inside Canada as well. All right, um, that Canada is like a big, huge cultural hodgepodge of culture from around the world, right? Um, but there is a Canadian culture if you look for it. There are Canadian TV shows, there are Canadian books, there are Canadian films, there are Canadian um, things, cultural things but you seem to have to look for it in order to find it, right? So, whereas an American or British or other cultures are just basically in your face, right? So if you want to look into Canadian written culture, the New Canadian Library is one of the. Oh, I forgot about these guys, but anyways, they're a minor. The Clark and Irwin paperbacks. There's another competition, but you don't see these around very much. All right, so that's another imprint that was in competition with the New Canadian Library. So you saw the New Canadian Library in 1958, and in the 60s it became popular because there was a there was a flowering of Canadian culture in the 60s. We started getting our own identity, literary wise, right? And in so many other ways, right? But literary wise, the flowering of Canadian literature happened in the 60s, and this was one of the reasons why the New Canadian Library, and then whole bunch of competitors came into the marketplace because they saw that that Canadian books could actually sell, right? And now we're back to the dark ages when it comes to Canadian literature because the new Canadian Library is basically dead because it's owned by a German conglomerate of like 300 something different imprints or whatever, right? So anyway, um, so that's basically an introduction to the new Canadian Library. It's fun to collect. It's fun to read. If you want to know about Canadian literature, this is where you would go. All right, and have fun reading and collecting. And I'll talk to you in my next video about another thing. All right, and thank you for watching. Leave a thumbs up if you liked it. Subscribe if you so choose, and I'll see you in my next video. And bye for now.